Monogamy or polygamy? Perhaps either one, depending on the individual. But what does the Bible really say about this subject? Stay with me. We'll discuss it in just a moment on this installment of Defending the Bible. This is Billy Anger. Thank you so much for taking time from your busy schedule to stop by and spend these few minutes with me as together we delve into a biblical defense for the integrity of the Holy Scriptures. Polygamy sounds great, someone once said, until you realize you must keep all your wives happy. You know, the Bible finds itself at the defense table yet again in the courtroom of public debate. And this time, it finds itself answering the many critics attempting to expose the Scriptures as being fraudulent due to its supposed contradictions about the subject of polygamy. Polygamy, as you well know, is the practice of a man having more than one wife at the same time. Polyandry, ironically enough, is not permitted in the Old Testament, whereas polygamy was. Polyandry is simply where a wife has multiple husbands. What we do know, though, that is undeniably true is the fact that the Bible does document polyamorous relationships. It begins in Genesis 4, where we discover Lamech taking two wives. Deuteronomy chapter 21 then gave permission to marry captured prisoners from foreign conquests. And it's in the book of Deuteronomy that God seems to legislate polygamy as a social practice. You see, provisions at that time were made for brothers to marry their sisters-in-law if the other brother had died. We know that most likely Queen Esther was the member of a harem. Boaz married a woman by the name of Ruth, but he, being advanced in years, surely had other wives. The fact is, there are so many instances in the Bible, frankly, far too many recorded instances in the pages of the Old Testament to ignore this subject. Abraham, Esau, Jacob's 4 wives, Gideon's many wives, Samson, David's 8 wives, and of course Solomon were all identified as polygamists. Ignoring that historical reality, again, benefits absolutely nobody. And due to that fact, many have concluded that God condoned, if not outright endorsed, bigamy in biblical times. As a matter of fact, Martin Luther, the great reformer, wrote in 1524, "I confess that I cannot forbid a person to marry several wives, for it does not contradict the Scripture." But is that true? Was Martin Luther correct? You see, permitting something is not the same thing as wanting something. And there is not one single verse in the Bible, not one, that encourages the practice of polygamy. Frankly, the opposite is the truth. It was never God's intention for mankind to be involved in polygamous relationships. But similar to divorce, God granted them polygamous relationships as He did decrees of divorcement because of the hardness of their hearts under the old covenant. But God's ideal for the human family is discovered at the creation of Adam and Eve. Genesis chapter 2 and verse 24 provides God's model for marriage. And it's in that verse we read the words, "Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and shall join." And that word join means cling to. He shall join to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. Notice God's mathematics. 2 makes 1, not 3, not 4, or even more, just 2. When the 10 Commandments were then communicated to Moses, notice that God was reiterating the sanctity of marriage. Exodus 20 and verse 14 disallows adulterous behavior. And this is a prohibition of multiple sex partners, for that's exactly what adultery is. But under the old covenant, mankind did not have the ability to live righteously before God. So mankind did according to his carnal passions and his unfulfilled spiritual void. He sought to satisfy the spiritual need inherent with all people by anesthetizing his emptiness through wanton pleasure. So why the restriction? If the answer isn't obvious to everybody and anybody, let's quickly cite some instances or examples in the Bible where polygamy resulted in a negative outcome. And frankly, most of them were marked by violence, because when the Bible records episodes of polygamy, unhappiness was always the result. Abraham and Hagar, and we'll only mention a few. Abraham took Hagar as his wife, as Sarah, his first wife, could not conceive children. This introduced an overabundance of strife and complications for Abraham and his descendants through the promised lineage. And today the Middle East is overtaken by the conflict that ensues, all as a result of Abraham's decision. What about Jacob? Thanks to the trickery of a man named Laban, his father-in-law, Jacob marries two sisters, Leah and then Rachel, but he's not finished yet. He then marries Rachel's maid Bilhah, followed by Leah's maid Zilpah. And these relationships caused him untold problems, unmitigated suffering. His house was in constant upheaval. How about David? His home was rife with violence. Touched by rape, incest, and ultimately murder ensues, all as the result of his polygamous lifestyle. And then there's Solomon. And I think the absolute worst tragedy that results from polygamy is documented in the life of Solomon. For this is what the Bible tells us. King Solomon loved many foreign women and had 700 wives and 300 concubines. And his wives led him astray. And Solomon grew old. His wives turned his heart after other gods. And his heart was not perfect before the Lord his God, as was the heart of his father David. It is significant to note, ladies and gentlemen, and let's not miss this point, and this would be my concluding thought, that when Jesus arrives, he resets the original code, reinforcing the pattern established for man by God at the beginning of time. He says this in Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 through 6. Have you not read, and we just cited this a moment ago, that at the beginning the Creator made them male and female, and for this reason a man, he said, shall leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let no man tear apart. You know, the most influential teacher in the entire New Testament church, of course, the Apostle Paul, galvanizes the monogamous concept in Ephesians chapter 5 and verse 28 when he says, because of the temptation to sexual immorality, each man should have his own wife and each woman her own husband. So my final thought is this. The Bible certainly does not endorse polygamy, even though such a practice was allowed in the Old Testament. No, this is not an issue of contradiction. It was permitted in the Old Testament, but it was certainly a deviation from God's intention. And Jesus clarified the issue in Matthew 19, once again returning to God's original prescription. Thanks for joining me on this episode of defending the Bible. I would love to hear from you. You can see my contact information on the screen. And we'll be back again next week with another edition of Defending the Bible.